Hi, my name is Myrle Krantz. I really love talking about open source, and this is my opportunity to explore the Observability Survey. This is a free report. It's based on 1,255 responses that Grafana Labs collected by outreach to our community. This is the third one that we've done. We're going to keep doing them, and you'll get a snapshot of how organizations approach observability today, where they think the industry is going, and maybe you'll learn something from this and contribute to it the next time round. As you look at this in the context of open source, you're probably going to start by looking at the top concerns. You're going to see that there's a wide variety of concerns that we asked people about. More noise to signal ratio, the challenge between the noise and the signal, like finding the most important pieces. Um, the complexity when you're trying to set these things up, the costs, the vendor lock-in, convincing management of value. I was looking at this trying to understand now, open source isn't mentioned as one of the top concerns here. It wasn't offered to people. But you'll notice that a couple of these things do play in to open source concerns, and one of them is costs. A lot of people think of open source as free. It's free as in puppies. You still have to feed it. There's also vendor lock-in here. This is really relevant for open source. A lot of people end up choosing open source, not because they're religious zealots about open source, because they want to be free of being forced to decide for a specific vendor. They want to be able to switch between vendors. They want to be able to use that to price pressure the vendors who are offering their products. There's also convincing management of value and predictability of costs and getting adoption within my organization. This last one also is relevant for open source, getting adoption within your organization, because oftentimes open source projects, especially foundation open source projects, are things that people have used at other companies when they change between companies. And getting people to use something that they've already used is always easier than getting people to use something completely new. Even if the new is better in some way, if it's something they're familiar with and they know the ins and outs of it, they're more likely to want to use that. So decision makers are starting with these top concerns, and then they're going and they're breaking them down into selection criteria. And so we also asked people, what are their selection criteria when they're choosing an observability product? Again, we see cost, we see ease of use, we see interoperability, we see based on open source. And here, what I found interesting is that based on open source was fairly far back in the list of selection criteria. But that doesn't mean that people don't care about open source. And what that means is that they, or at least what I think that means, is that they understand that open source isn't a concern by itself. Open source is a way of achieving certain kinds of concerns. Open source is a way of achieving a lower cost. It's a way of making it easier for your users to learn the technology sometimes. It's definitely a way to improve interoperability with other technologies because open source often pairs with open standards. We're going to dig down into that a little bit more later. And open source historically has not had enough designers engaged with those projects because open source projects are often pieces of a larger product. And also because the engineering sort of systems around open source are not necessarily well designed for creating engagement among designers, this can make open source projects harder to use. And it's actually one of the things that tends to work against open source product adoption. Also, one of the things we see there's a lovely paper from Baldwin and Clark about how architecture drives the economics of open source. We see that these economics of open source often drive a certain amount of fragmentation of the solutions. Like people take a product and they break it out into individual projects and they compose those projects into something they sell, but that's the product. The projects themselves are not necessarily very usable all by themselves. They have to be composed with other things. Again, that pushes against ease of use, but it pushes towards more flexibility and more interoperability with other tools. Interesting sidebar too is we noticed in this survey that a lot of people are using a lot of different observability technologies in their companies. So the sort of medium mean was around 4 different observability technologies, but we had people using as many as 100 observability technologies. And similar, the data sources, these are often these are often also open source technologies. People were using a lot. This is being driven by some of the same economics, right? Um, People are using solutions that are open source. People are creating solutions that are open source for a wide variety of different problems. These companies are then taking these data sources and putting them together and looking and creating their dashboards to look at them. So one of the great things about Grafana is it makes it possible to manage this very fragmented technology landscape. And this is part of the reason why I think that Grafana is so powerful. Um, and in this case, you've got open source sort of easing adoption by making it easier to view other open source projects. We've got this virtual cycle going on. Another thing that open source does to ease adoption, I actually saw this at an insurance company in Cologne a couple of years ago. Sometimes there's budgets, right? People have a budget for their observability tool, whatever it is, and then their developers start to run up against those budgets and they want to solve that problem. And the easiest thing for them to do is to take something that's free. So they install Prometheus and use Prometheus and start creating solutions around that. And they don't have to go through a decision maker for that because there are no costs involved. Um, for more sophisticated decision makers, though, this is strategic, right? They're picking open source software because of the avoidance of the problem of vendor lock-in. What does vendor lock-in mean? And this is something that I keep hearing people saying, like, we don't want vendor lock-in. We don't want to use project or product XYZ because there's some sort of vendor lock-in associated with that. Different people mean different things when they're saying this, right? Let's take a couple of projects as examples. Prometheus. Prometheus is a foundation open source project. When people use Prometheus, they can assume that even if one of the companies that's working on Prometheus goes under or changes focus or otherwise stops contributing to Prometheus, that Prometheus will continue to be a viable project. So when people say, I don't want vendor lock-in, in the context of something like Prometheus, they're saying, I want to be able to continue to use this project, regardless of what happens to my vendor of today. But it can also mean other things, right? So OpenTelemetry, for example, includes a strong component of open standards. Transport protocols are defined. Semantic conventions are defined. When people say, I don't want vendor lock-in, in this case, they could be saying that I want to be able to combine multiple solutions from different vendors because these standards, the transport protocols and the semantic conventions, these make it possible to make these pieces interoperate. The foundation provides continuity, but the foundation also provides a place where all of these different vendors can collaborate and make a higher quality solution potentially, but potentially also a slower moving one, right? So there's also these risks around this. If you're insisting on a vendor neutral solution, that could mean that that you're going to wait a long time for the vendors to agree on something. For all of these things, you're going to end up paying for support because while the code is non-rivalrous, right? You can copy code as many times as you want. I create the code once, and then you can use it, and you can use it, and you can use it, and none of that impinges on each other. People's time is a rivalrous resource, right? So people are going to run out of time. That's why you need to pay for it so that you can show that like your support request is more important than that person's support request because you're willing to pay for it and the other person isn't. So vendor lock-in, like avoiding vendor lock-in doesn't solve all of your problems. You still are going to have to ask for help. All right, so let's drill down into some of our specific open source projects. We've got OpenTelemetry adoption, and we also asked about Prometheus adoption. I found it really interesting here that people who are using OpenTelemetry exclusively are also using Prometheus exclusively. That tells me that people are not seeing OpenTelemetry and Prometheus as mutually exclusive technologies. So you can use nothing but OpenTelemetry and still also use nothing but Prometheus. I think that's a good thing because they aren't mutually exclusive. One thing we also noticed here in the survey for both OpenTelemetry and Prometheus, roughly 50% of the respondents claim that they're using these technologies more than last year. Again, these growth trends are reinforcing each other, I think. They're not excluding each other. People aren't treating Prometheus and OpenTelemetry as competitors. And that makes a lot of sense, too, if we look at what the Prometheus and OpenTelemetry communities are doing. The Prometheus community in 2024 at their PromCon came to the conclusion that they wanted to make Prometheus the default choice to store OpenTelemetry metrics. There's a nice little blog post on that too that Gotham and Carrie put together. OTel support was also one of the core features for the Prometheus version 3.0 that was released in November 2024. There's still a lot of specific problems that the Prometheus and OpenTelemetry communities need to resolve in order to make that compatibility better. But they're working on it, and they're making a lot of progress. And so this increase in usage that we're seeing here, and the increase in interest that we're seeing here between both Prometheus and OpenTelemetry makes a lot of sense. And all of the signals also go towards people continuing to increase that. So if we look, for example, at the Google Trends on searches for OpenTelemetry, we just see that increasing over time. Now, if we look at the survey results here, we're also going to see that that it's not as mature as Prometheus. So we've got, if you look at people just using it in general, the trends are roughly the same for Prometheus and OpenTelemetry, but there's a lot more Prometheus users using it in production, and more OpenTelemetry users using it in like they're investigating it, or they're using it in a sort of a proof of concept. Let's end this conversation on one last mystery that I would like to see us exploring more in the next survey. If we look at the use of open source and the use of SaaS, I was very interested to see that we've got self-managed only and open source only here being kind of the largest bucket of our survey respondents. This tells me that for some reason, and I have a couple of theories what the reason might be, for some reason, open source only and SaaS only are not being seen as mutually exclusive. What this tells me is that people are seeing these things as somehow, at least some of these people are seeing these things as somehow complementary. They are possibly, one possibility is that they are treating SaaS that deploys open source technologies as open source only. Or another possibility, they care about what they're deploying on their own infrastructure, and they want to pair that with SaaS. And maybe they care, maybe they don't, about whether or not the SaaS is open source. So what I'd like to see in the next survey is for us to drill down in that and figure out, like, do people care that their SaaS is open source? It's possible they do. Maybe this is providing a migration path for them. If they're looking for vendor neutrality, then they're achieving it maybe by saying, okay, well, we're using this vendor now, but if we have to, then we can deploy the technology ourselves and migrate. Or maybe they're saying, okay, well, as long as we are deploying open technology, open source technology on our infrastructure with open standards, then we can take those ingestion pipelines. I'm taking in my observability data. We can take those ingestion pipelines and we can point them to another vendor. I would love to know the answer to that. Maybe we'll find out next time around. But enough from me. Why don't y'all go and check out that report and also the interactive dashboards and drill down on it, and maybe you'll discover some interesting things and share them with each other as well.